I found out he'd been calling me unstable the same way I found out our marriage was already dead, through someone else's mouth, careless and cruel, like my name was nothing more than a rumor meant to be laughed at. You know, he says you were intense, my friend Keisha told me, stirring her coffee too fast, eyes refusing to meet mine. That you scared him, that you're still obsessed. I didn't flinch. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself, because the truth didn't need me to scream. It was winter again, the kind of cold that presses into your chest, and I sat there remembering how silence had once saved my life, how it still could. After the divorce papers were signed, Marcus rewrote our history like a man who'd practiced lying in the mirror, to his new fiancée, to mutual friends, to anyone who would listen. I became the unstable ex-wife, the emotional one, the problem, the woman he survived. And I let him, not because it didn't hurt, but because I knew something he didn't. Years earlier, back when I was still fighting to make our marriage work, we sat on a beige couch in a quiet therapy office, holding hands for show, while he spoke in half-truths and carefully edited confessions. He was charming even then, polished, calm, the kind of man who sounded reasonable while slowly dismantling your reality. But the therapist heard everything. She heard him gaslight me until I doubted my own memory. She heard him minimize his affairs, call them misunderstandings. She watched him twist my reactions into proof that I was the problem. She watched me shrink, apologize, explain myself into exhaustion. And when the marriage ended, I didn't leave that office. I stayed. Week after week, I sat in that same chair, rebuilding myself piece by piece, learning to trust my instincts again, learning the difference between love and control, learning that being calm in chaos didn't make me strong, it made me invisible. Marcus moved on fast. He always needed an audience. His new fiancée was younger, bright-eyed, accomplished. People said she balanced him, that she calmed him down, that he was finally happy. And still, I stayed quiet. When friends forwarded screenshots, when relatives hinted I should clear my name, when someone asked why I never told my side, I smiled. I said nothing. Because lies move fast, but patterns move forever. Months passed. I healed. I slept through the night. I laughed without checking who might be offended by my joy. Therapy stopped being about survival and started being about vision. Then one afternoon, as I was leaving a session, my therapist paused at the door. Her face didn't change. Her voice stayed professional, but her eyes held something else. "Just so you know," she said gently, "life has a way of bringing things full circle." I didn't understand what she meant then, not until weeks later when fate walked into the same waiting room, carrying his lies with her, and sat down to tell her story. I didn't know her name at first. I only noticed her because she sat in my old chair. Same corner of the waiting room, same soft gray fabric, same nervous way of crossing and uncrossing her legs, like she wasn't sure whether she deserved the space she occupied. I froze mid-step, my coat half on, my purse strap slipping from my shoulder. For a second, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might be sick. Not because she looked like him, but because she looked like me. Same polite smile that apologizes before speaking, same careful posture of someone who's learned not to take up too much room, same eyes scanning the floor as if searching for permission to exist without causing trouble. She looked up when she felt my stare. Our eyes met. There was no recognition on her face, only kindness, only nerves. I nodded out of instinct. She smiled back. And just like that, I walked out into the cold with a truth buzzing under my skin. I didn't need confirmation. I already knew. Marcus had brought her here. Not literally, he wasn't allowed in this space anymore, but emotionally. He'd handed her the same confusion, the same self-doubt, the same quiet erosion of self, and told her it was love. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, because suddenly, the silence I'd kept didn't feel passive anymore. It felt strategic. In therapy, I had learned something that saved me. Abusers don't change their tactics, they change their audience. The script stays the same, only the characters rotate. And the therapist, she was the only constant. I imagined the sessions unfolding. The fiancé, careful, articulate, probably started by saying things like, "He's amazing, really, but sometimes I feel like I'm the problem. He says I'm sensitive. He says I misremember things. He says his ex was unstable, so maybe this is just how relationships feel with me." And I knew, without hearing a word, that my therapist would do exactly what she'd done for me. She wouldn't contradict, she wouldn't warn, she wouldn't expose. She would listen. She would reflect patterns. She would ask simple questions. She would hold up a mirror so clean it terrified the person standing in front of it. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, from anticipation, because this wasn't about revenge. I didn't want to humiliate him. I didn't want to confront her. I didn't want to be seen as the bitter ex confirming his narrative. This was bigger. This was about watching truth do what it does best when left alone. Surface. Weeks passed. I continued my sessions, careful never to ask questions that crossed ethical lines. We talked about my career, my boundaries, the quiet confidence growing inside me. But sometimes in the pauses, I felt it, an invisible thread pulling tight. Then one afternoon, my therapist said something that made my breath catch. "People often think manipulation looks loud," she said thoughtfully, "but most of the time, it's gentle, it sounds reasonable, it feels familiar." I swallowed. "So how do you know?" I asked. "You don't, at first. You just notice the same feelings repeating. Confusion, self-blame, exhaustion. And eventually, you ask why the pattern keeps showing up with the same person." My phone buzzed later that evening. A mutual acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey," the message read, "random question. Does Marcus ever twist stories to make you doubt yourself?" I stared at the screen. The silence I'd kept for so long finally echoed back at me. And for the first time since the divorce, I smiled. Not because I felt vindicated, but because I knew the truth was already knocking on her door. And she was finally close enough to hear it. The message sat on my phone like a held breath. "Does Marcus ever twist stories to make you doubt yourself?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what not to say. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows from the streetlight outside crawl slowly across the room. There was a time when a question like that would have sent me spiraling, a time when I would have over-explained, defended myself, tried to be believed. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Therapy had taught me restraint, silence with intention, the power of letting someone arrive at the truth without being pushed. So I typed one sentence. "Why do you ask?" The reply came almost immediately. "She's struggling," the message said. "His fiancé. She's been saying things that sound familiar." Familiar. The word landed heavy in my chest because familiarity had been my prison for years. Familiar arguments, familiar apologies, familiar promises that never quite reached the truth. I didn't respond again. I didn't need to. Over the next few weeks, things shifted in subtle ways. Invitations stopped including Marcus. Conversations grew awkward when his name came up. People who once parroted his version of events now hesitated, like they were finally hearing the echo in his stories. And then there was the waiting room. Every Tuesday at 4:30, I arrived 10 minutes early out of habit. Every Tuesday, she was already there, sitting straighter now, her smile tighter, her eyes no longer scanning the floor but fixed on nothing in particular. Once she rubbed her temples the entire time. Another week she cried silently into her scarf. We never spoke. We didn't need to. I watched the transformation the same way I'd lived it, slow, painful, undeniable. One afternoon, as I stood to leave, I heard her voice behind me. "Excuse me." I turned. She looked smaller up close, not weak, just worn thin by confusion, by loving someone who made her question her own mind. "I just wanted to say—" She hesitated, then stopped herself. "Never mind." I smiled gently. "Take your time." She nodded, eyes shining, and sat back down. That night, I dreamed of the beige couch, of Marcus's calm voice explaining why my feelings were exaggerated, of the therapist's steady gaze, waiting, not judging, just waiting for the truth to reveal itself. In my next session, I finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. Do patterns ever scare people when they start seeing them? My therapist folded her hands thoughtfully. "Yes," she said, "because once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it, and then you have to decide what it means." I exhaled slowly. "And if someone asks a question they already know the answer to?" A pause. "Then," she said softly, "they're closer to leaving than they realize." That evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a mutual friend. It was an unfamiliar number. The message was short. "I think I need to talk to you." No name, no explanation, but I knew exactly who it was from. And for the first time, I wondered not what Marcus would do when the truth caught up to him, but what she would do once she finally said it out loud. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. "I think I need to talk to you." No greeting, no apology, no accusation, just a sentence heavy with realization. I didn't reply that night, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for the process. Hers, mine, the invisible line between healing and interference that therapy had taught me never to cross. Instead, I sat with the memory of how long it took me to ask for help, how many nights I rehearsed questions I was too afraid to ask, how silence had once protected me, and how timing had saved me. The next morning, I responded, "I'm open to listening, no pressure. You decide when." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Thank you," she wrote. "That means more than you know." We met a week later at a quiet cafe across town, neutral ground, sunlight spilling through wide windows like it wanted to witness something important. She arrived early. I recognized the tension immediately, the stiff shoulders, the careful breathing, the way she checked her phone like she might need an escape route. When she saw me, her face softened with relief, then tightened with fear. I smiled gently. "Hi." "Hi," she said, voice barely steady. We sat across from each other, 2 women bound by the same man, separated by time and truth. She spoke first. "I'm not here to blame you," she said quickly, "or ask you to confirm anything. I needed to see you as a real person." I nodded. "I get that." Her hands trembled around her cup. "He tells stories about you, about how emotional you were, how unstable, how he tried everything to make it work." I said nothing. "And then," she whispered, "my therapist asked why his stories never match how my body reacts. That stopped me cold." She looked up. She said, "If you were truly the problem, why do you feel smaller every time you explain yourself?" The room went quiet. I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not satisfaction, recognition. "I didn't come to warn you, and I won't tell you what to do, but I will say this. I spent years believing I was the problem because someone needed me to be." Her eyes filled with tears. "He says the same things," she admitted. "Same phrases, same calm tone, same look when I start questioning him, like I've disappointed him." I exhaled slowly. That look is how control dresses itself. She laughed weakly, then covered her mouth. "God, I thought I was losing my mind." "You're not. You're waking up." We sat in silence after that, not awkward, not heavy, just honest. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. "Did he ever—" Then she stopped. "Did he ever admit to cheating?" I met her eyes. "Eventually, when denial stopped working." She closed her eyes. "I think I already know what I need to do," she said quietly. I placed my hand over hers, not to guide, not to influence, just to remind her she wasn't alone. As we walked out separately, I felt something shift in the air. Truth had crossed a threshold, and somewhere Marcus was still telling the same stories, unaware that the audience was no longer listening. Because once someone sees the pattern, they don't ask for proof anymore. They ask for freedom. After that cafe meeting, everything went quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that hums beneath the surface, charged with decision, the kind that comes right before something breaks open. I didn't hear from her for days. I didn't ask around. I didn't check social media. That wasn't my role. Instead, I focused on my own life, the one I had rebuilt so carefully. Morning walks, work that fulfilled me, evenings that ended without knots in my stomach. I reminded myself that my healing didn't depend on what happened next. But still, I felt it. The way you feel a storm approaching before the clouds gather. In my next therapy session, I spoke her name out loud for the first time. "I met her," I said simply. My therapist nodded, unsurprised. "And how did that feel?" "Strange," I admitted, like looking at an earlier version of myself, but also like closing a loop I didn't know was still open. She leaned back slightly. "You didn't rescue her." "No," I said. "I just listened." "That's exactly right." Later that week, Marcus tried to reach me. An email. Polite, controlled, almost friendly. He wrote about growth, about misunderstandings, about how he hoped I was finally at peace. I didn't respond, because I recognized the timing. Something had shifted in his world and he could feel it. 2 days later, my phone buzzed. It was her. "I ended the engagement," the message read. My breath caught. Not from shock, but from recognition, the same quiet certainty I'd felt the night I packed my bags and left. She sent another message. "He kept asking where this was coming from. I told him I needed clarity. He said I was being influenced." I closed my eyes. Same script, different woman. "He asked if you'd spoken to you," she continued. I didn't answer. I typed slowly. "You don't owe anyone access to your healing." A pause. "Thank you," she wrote, "for not warning me. I think if you had, I wouldn't have believed you." I smiled softly at that. Because truth doesn't land when it's thrown, it lands when it's recognized. The fallout came fast. Friends called with half stories. Marcus was confused, heartbroken, blindsided. He told people he didn't understand why women kept leaving him without explanation. I heard it all secondhand. And still, I stayed silent. Because I didn't need to correct the record anymore. The record was correcting itself. One evening, weeks later, I ran into him unexpectedly at the grocery store. Same calm posture, same rehearsed smile. He looked startled, then relieved. "Hey," he said, "I've been meaning to reach out." "I know," I replied evenly. He studied my face, searching for cracks. "I don't know what she told you," he began. I held up a hand. "She didn't tell me anything." That unsettled him. "But," I added calmly, "you did." His smile faltered. I leaned in just enough for him to hear me clearly. The truth doesn't need witnesses forever. Eventually, it speaks for itself. I walked away before he could respond, and for the first time since our marriage ended, I didn't feel like I was escaping him. I felt like I had outgrown him. Because the most powerful vindication isn't exposure. It's watching someone lose control of the narrative and realizing you no longer need to be part of it. After that night at the grocery store, I slept better than I had in years. Not because everything was resolved, but because something inside me finally was. Marcus stopped trying to contact me after that. No more carefully worded emails, no more checking in, no more pretending we were two mature adults who had simply grown apart. The silence this time didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like defeat. Word traveled slowly, then all at once. The engagement ending wasn't framed as dramatic. There was no explosion, no public fallout, just a quiet withdrawal. Invitations rescinded, photos removed, her name no longer attached to his. People began to ask questions they'd never asked before. Not about me, about him. He always seemed so calm, but why do all his relationships end the same way? Why does every woman leave looking smaller than when she arrived? Why does he never take responsibility? I heard these things through distance, like echoes bouncing back from walls I no longer lived inside. In therapy, we talked about closure, not as an apology, not as justice, but as neutrality. The goal, my therapist said, isn't to feel nothing, it's to feel free. I thought about that for a long time. Freedom wasn't loud, it wasn't vindictive, it didn't need an audience. Freedom was waking up without rehearsing conversations. Freedom was trusting my own memory. Freedom was knowing that my calm wasn't weakness, it was discernment. One afternoon, I received a final message from her. She wrote, "I wanted you to know that I'm staying in therapy. I'm learning to trust myself again." I smiled, tears stinging unexpectedly. "I'm glad," I replied. "You deserve peace." She sent one more message. "I finally understand why you stayed quiet." That one I didn't respond to, because some truths don't need to be confirmed, they just need to be lived. Weeks turned into months. Marcus faded into the background of my life, not erased, but irrelevant. He became a lesson rather than a wound. And then something surprising happened. I stopped thinking about him at all. Not out of bitterness, out of disinterest. The story he told about me no longer followed me. It had nowhere to land. People stopped repeating it when they realized it didn't match the woman standing in front of them, steady, grounded, whole. One evening, as I walked home under soft city lights, I realized something that made me laugh quietly to myself. I never defended my name, and yet it stood clean. Because truth doesn't rush, it doesn't shout, it doesn't chase, it waits. And when someone is finally ready to see it, it shows up without being asked. I thought that would be the end of it, that once the engagement dissolved and the silence settled, the story would finally close, that Marcus would shrink into a footnote of my past, something I'd learned from and left behind. But healing doesn't always end with quiet. sometimes it invites one last test. It came in the form of an unexpected call from my therapist's office. Not urgent, not alarming, just unusual. She asked if I was open to a brief check-in outside our regular session. When I arrived, I could tell immediately something had shifted. My therapist's posture was calm, but thoughtful, like someone who'd been holding a truth gently and waiting for the right moment to set it down. "I want to be very clear," she said, folding her hands. "I'm not sharing anything confidential, and I'm not asking you to intervene." I nodded. "But," she continued, "your ex's former fiancé has made a significant decision, one that overlaps ethically, emotionally, and humanly." My chest tightened. "She asked to switch therapists," my therapist said, "not because of discomfort, but because she believes continuing here helped her see a pattern she can no longer ignore, and she wants to fully separate from anything connected to him." I exhaled slowly. She also asked me something, a question I couldn't answer directly, but I think it matters that you know it was asked. "What was it?" I asked quietly. She asked if the woman he described as unstable ever truly healed, or if she just disappeared. That landed harder than I expected, because I remembered the version of myself he talked about, the one he painted as fragile, dramatic, obsessive, the one he used as a shield against accountability. And yet, here I was, not broken, not bitter, not gone. I told her, my therapist continued, that healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like distance, sometimes it looks like silence, and sometimes it looks like a woman who no longer needs to explain herself. Tears welled up then, not from pain, but from recognition. Later that evening, I sat alone with a cup of tea, replaying those words. He had spent years telling people who I was, and without lifting a finger, without correcting a single lie, without exposing him, I had become the contradiction. The next morning, I woke up to a message from a mutual friend. "I ran into Marcus last night. He seemed off. He said therapy turned everyone against him." I stared at the screen, then laughed softly. Because therapy doesn't turn people against you, it just turns the lights on. I realized then that the story wasn't done, not because he still mattered, but because this was the final turning point, the moment when the narrative he built finally collapsed under his own weight. And the truth? It was about to finish what it started. I didn't hear from Marcus again after that. Not directly. But his absence became louder than any message he'd ever sent. People began to treat him differently. Conversations paused when he entered rooms. Invitations thinned. That effortless charm he once used like currency stopped working the way it used to, not because anyone had confronted him, but because enough women had quietly stepped away. Patterns were being noticed, and once a pattern is seen, it can't be unseen. I ran into his sister at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. We exchanged polite smiles, the kind people use when they don't know which version of the past to acknowledge. Later that night, she found me near the balcony. "I just wanted to say," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "I think you handled everything with a lot of grace." I nodded. "Thank you." She shifted, clearly holding something back. "I used to think you were too sensitive," she admitted. "That's what he said." There it was. "And now?" I asked gently. She looked down. "Now I think you were just the first to stop accepting it." That was all she said before walking away. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of that truth settle. Being first doesn't make you wrong, it just makes you early. Weeks passed. My life continued forward, not as a reaction to him, but as a return to myself. I took up painting again. I laughed more easily. I trusted my instincts without second-guessing them. One afternoon, while cleaning out old emails, I found a draft I'd written years ago but never sent. It was addressed to Marcus. In it, I tried to explain how his words made me feel, how his denial twisted my sense of reality, how I just wanted honesty. I read it once, then I deleted it, because I didn't need him to understand anymore. Understanding had found its way to everyone else. And then, unexpectedly, I received one final message from her. She wrote, "I moved out today. I felt strong doing it, not angry, just clear." I closed my eyes, relief washing over me, not for him, not for what was lost, but for what was reclaimed. She continued, "I used to wonder why you didn't warn me. Now I know. You trusted me to see for myself." I replied with the simplest truth I had. "You did." That night, I stood by my window, watching the city lights flicker. Somewhere out there, Marcus was likely trying to rewrite the story again, telling himself a new version where he was misunderstood. But it wouldn't stick this time, because the truth had already been planted, and it was still growing. The strange thing about truth is that once it's been recognized, it doesn't just affect one relationship, it ripples. I started noticing it in subtle ways. People who had once defended Marcus now avoided bringing him up altogether. Others asked me questions, not invasive, not curious in a gossiping way, but reflective, careful, as if they were finally examining memories that had never quite sat right. One woman pulled me aside after a community event. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," she said quietly, "but did he ever make you doubt your own memory?" I held her gaze and answered honestly, "Every day." Her face softened, not in shock, but in confirmation. "I thought it was just me," she whispered. That was when I understood something deeper. My silence hadn't protected him. It had protected me. Because now, when the truth surfaced, it didn't look like retaliation, it looked like recognition, shared experiences aligning, stories finally making sense. Marcus didn't lose his reputation overnight. He lost it slowly, through accumulation, through women comparing notes without drama, through calm conversations that didn't include his voice at all. That kind of unraveling is impossible to stop. One evening, I sat across from my therapist again, reflecting on how far things had come. "You never tried to expose him," she said. "You let the system do what it's meant to do when people stay honest." "I think," I replied slowly, "I was done trying to be believed." She smiled. "That's usually when people start listening." There was power in that. Not the loud kind, the grounded kind. A few weeks later, I heard that Marcus had stopped therapy altogether, claimed it was biased, claimed people were projecting onto him, claimed he was the real victim. The same words, the same defense, but this time no one rushed to reassure him, because patterns don't argue, they reveal. I found peace in knowing I didn't have to be part of his collapse. I wasn't standing at the edge watching. I was already gone, living a life where his presence wasn't required. One night as I journaled before bed, I wrote something that surprised even me. "I don't want justice, I want distance." And I had it. The woman he once called unstable was now stable enough to walk away without needing proof of his downfall. And the man who built his identity on control, he was finally losing it, one quiet realization at a time. The last time I heard Marcus's name, it came from someone who barely knew me, a new colleague. Casual conversation, no history. He seems intense, she said, stirring her coffee, like he's always explaining himself before anyone asks. I didn't react. I didn't correct her. I didn't add context. I just nodded. Because when someone reaches that stage, the story has already moved beyond repair. What struck me wasn't satisfaction, it was distance. Emotional, psychological, spiritual distance. The kind you don't have to maintain consciously because it's already settled in your bones. That night, I thought about the version of myself who once begged to be understood, the woman who rehearsed conversations in the mirror, who collected evidence of her own sanity like it was something she had to earn. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her one thing. You don't need to prove the truth to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Marcus built his identity on contrast. He was calm because I was chaotic, reasonable because I was emotional, logical because I was unstable. Without me in that role, he had nothing to push against. And it showed. Friends stopped asking me about him not because they didn't care, but because the story had resolved itself. There was nothing left to investigate, nothing left to clarify. The most telling moment came unexpectedly. I received a handwritten note in the mail, no return address. The handwriting was familiar. It was from his former fiancée. She wrote about rebuilding, about learning to sit with discomfort instead of explaining it away, about realizing how often she'd been told to be patient instead of being heard. At the end, she wrote, "I understand now why you never warned me. You trusted truth to do what it always does. Wait." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Silence isn't weakness, distance isn't avoidance, and vindication doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives as peace so complete that the past can't reach you anymore. Or so I thought, because just when I believed the story had finally closed, I received a message that made my breath catch, a message that suggested Marcus wasn't done unraveling yet. The message came just after midnight. I stared at my phone for a long moment before opening it, already knowing, without knowing, exactly who it was from. Marcus. The name alone felt unfamiliar now, like reading a character from a book I'd finished years ago. Still, my pulse shifted, not from fear, not from longing, from curiosity. "I owe you an apology," the message began. I didn't reply. I set the phone down, brushed my teeth, climbed into bed, and let the silence stretch. Old me would have analyzed every word, searching for sincerity between the lines. New me understood something better. Timing is a language, and this message was late, too late to be honest. The next morning, there was another. "I've been doing a lot of reflecting." Then another. "I know I hurt you." Then the final one. "I think I finally understand." That was the one that made me pause, because people who truly understand don't announce it. They change. I carried the phone with me all day without responding, took it to work, took it on a walk, let the messages sit unopened like unopened mail from an address I no longer lived at. In therapy that week, I mentioned it briefly. "He reached out," I said. My therapist nodded calmly. "And how does that feel?" I searched for the answer. "Like he's trying to reinsert himself into a story that's already ended." She smiled softly. "Then you already know what to do." That night, I finally responded. One message, one sentence. "I don't need an apology. I needed peace, and I have it now." I blocked him immediately after, not out of anger, out of clarity. The next day, I learned, through a friend, not through him, that Marcus had called off all social media, stopped attending group events, left town for a fresh start. I felt nothing. No triumph, no bitterness, no need to chase closure, because closure had arrived quietly months ago when I stopped needing him to see me clearly. The woman he painted as unstable had become unmovable, and the man who once controlled the narrative, he was running from it. That night, as I sat alone with a journal in my lap, I wrote the last line of a chapter I never thought I'd finish. They didn't believe me at first, but belief was never the point. I closed the book, turned off the light, and breathed deeply. I didn't know it yet, but the final lesson was still waiting, and it would change the way I understood vindication forever. The last lesson came quietly. No phone call, no dramatic revelation, no moment where the world stopped and clapped. It came on an ordinary morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, staring at my own reflection, and realizing I trusted her completely. That was new. I trusted my memory, I trusted my emotions, I trusted the version of events I used to apologize for believing. For years, Marcus had taught me to doubt myself so smoothly I didn't even notice it happening. Every argument ended with me questioning my tone instead of his behavior. Every betrayal was reframed as my overreaction. Every boundary was labeled drama. And when the marriage ended, he didn't just leave, he rewrote me. But here's what I understand now. People who lie about you are usually trying to outrun who they were with you. I never chased the truth down. I never corrected every rumor. I never stood on a stage explaining my side. I healed. And healing has a way of rearranging reality. The therapist didn't betray anyone's confidence. I didn't expose anything. I didn't warn or interfere or insert myself. I simply became well. And wellness is dangerous to people who survive on confusion. His new fiancée didn't leave because of me. She left because patterns don't change just because the cast does. She saw what I once couldn't, until I did. That was the justice. Not revenge, not validation, not an apology sent too late. Freedom. Freedom looks like walking into rooms without bracing yourself. Freedom looks like being believed without explaining. Freedom looks like silence that feels safe instead of heavy. Sometimes the most powerful response to being painted as unstable is becoming so grounded that the lie can't survive in your presence. I didn't win because he lost. I won because I refused to keep bleeding just to prove I was wounded. And that, more than anything else, is how I know I healed. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I truly love to know.